If you are studying operational research, management science, business analytics, or something in that, definitely in this area? Hands up. Okay. And how many of you are doing some other subject, biology, physics, whatever, and just have an interest? Okay, so it's about half and half. That's good, because I sort of balance this talk to cope with both those groups of people. So there will be a little bit about what I was about, but not too much. But rather more about things of general interest to those that know that already. Let's just have a look. I'm going to start off just by talking a bit about extending really what Vince was showing about the sort of role of R in life. My take on it anyway. Then a bit about my life in R, and that's not because my life in R is hugely important or interesting, but it is a life in R, and it's the only one that I have direct personal experience of, being me, and it might be helpful to you just to know somebody talking through that. Anybody talking through that would be useful. I think some of the other speakers today will give you some glimpse of that as well, but I'll just give you mine. And rather more importantly, what about your life in OR, question mark, because that's the sort of thing you'll be thinking about. So they're the three main sections. Okay, OR. I have a take on OR. You can read what it says on the websites and the textbooks about operational research. My take on it may be slightly different from some of those. It comes down to the same thing in the end, though. I think, for me, operational research is what I describe as systems improvement science. Perhaps I should explain that a little. First of all, it's a science, in the general sense of the word. It could be mathematics, it is mathematics sometimes, but it also could just be doing diagrams in a disciplined and structured way. There's a whole range of things that can be a scientific, disciplined, rigorous approach. And I guess the archetype of it all is something like a computer simulation model, which sort of brings those sort of two together. So it's a science, okay? We didn't dwell any more on that. The next point, it's an improvement science, and that is worth perhaps pointing out. There is a difference, a really fundamental difference between operational research and, say, physics or biology. Those subjects, absolutely rightly, are interested in knowledge for its own sake, and I have no arguments whatsoever with that. But OR is not in that same category. OR is interested not in knowledge for its own sake. OR is interested in knowledge because it actually leads you to something. It leads you to doing something better. And our tagline is, for operational research, the science of better. So we're in the same sort of category as medicine or architecture, in which we're trying to build things and do things and solve problems, and we're trying to improve things. So it's a science of improvement. And lastly, it's not just improving anything. What sort of things it's improving? It's improving systems, rather particular sorts of systems. They have to be quite complex systems involving not just things, but also people, quite complex systems like that, systems of real life. Okay, so my take on it is systems improvement science. Okay, and you've already seen that in real life, OR is involved in a wide range of sectors. Health sector, energy, manufacturing, you saw, defence, telecommunications, leisure industry, retail, aircraft, airports and aircraft, and finance. And that's not the whole list by any means. And it's also involved in a huge range of applications. Here's just a few, whether it's logistics or workforce planning or credit scoring or performance measurement, scheduling, whatever, a huge range of applications, and you've seen something of that as well, and you'll see more today, so I'm not going to go on in great depth about that. And it uses a huge spectrum of techniques. Now, those of you who are involved in this already, bear with me on this, just a slide for those that may be coming in from a slightly one stage removed. There's a spectrum of techniques here. At the bottom right-hand corner, you've got things like mathematical modelling, statistical analysis, discrete event simulation. Okay? Quantitative techniques, things you can do at a desk. At the top left-hand side, you've got much more qualitative techniques, things like behavioural simulation, that's role-playing games to the rest of us, and scenario analysis. And these are more qualitative techniques. They're things that you quite often do in groups of people rather than behind a desk. But they still, the way that OR does them, are disciplined and rigorous in the way we do it. Brainstorming, you perhaps argue about. And I think we have disciplined ways actually of doing brainstorming, your own ways of doing that. So there's a whole range of techniques there, ranging across that spectrum. I'll just pick out that middle section because there's something interesting, I think, about that middle section. It does relate to what I said before. There's two there that have the word systems in them. One of them is on the more quantitative side, system dynamics modelling, or sort of simulation modelling. The other side is on the qualitative side, what's called soft systems modelling, which is a more group-based activity. Again, I'm not going to go into that today. I just wanted to draw out the point that systems is at the heart, from my point of view, of what we're doing. We're looking at systems. Just going back to the improvement, if we're trying to improve things, you do have to, at some point, influence some decision makers. So we're really concerned about how we do get that done. And there's a sort of hurdle race involved here. You've got to make sure that what you're doing is available, that it's visible, that it's seen as relevant, come back to that perhaps, and that it's affordable. If you're a manager, you'll be looking at all those things. But also you'll be looking at whether it's comprehensible, whether it's convincing. Do I believe this analyst? Is it practical? Can I actually do anything with it? Is it on time? No good if it's a month or even a day late sometimes. So we have to pay attention to all of those sorts of things. And because we do that, and because we've got some quite powerful methods at our disposal, we've got a pretty good history of achievements. And I've just taken two out of what could be hundreds or if not thousands. And they're separated by 75 years, which is why I picked them. One of them is about what happened just before the war and during the war, and one of them is what happened a few weeks ago. The wartime one, for those of you that don't know, operational research under that name started off just before the Second World War. You can look back further in history to find examples of that sort of work. But under that name, you need to go to that sort of time. At that time, there was a major issue about how to incorporate the then new technique of radar into our air defence system. What we had was an air defence system inherited from the First World War, which had observers with binoculars and so on, scattered all over the country, linked with telephone lines, people trying to get those messages, make sense of the messages and tell what was happening at the airfields, what was going on, so they could tell the aircraft crew. And there was a developing system there of how to do that, which wasn't too bad a system actually, but it hadn't incorporated radar, and radar obviously was a game changer in terms of air defence. And there were some really quite difficult problems about that. And an operational research team, as it then became known, was set up to tackle that problem. And it did it so successfully that operational research was then spread throughout all of the war forces during the war. And the official history of the war says that the efficacy of our Air Force, our fighter force, at the time of the Battle of Britain, was doubled because of our air defence system, which had been developed by operational researchers. Now, doubled is quite impressive. It's rather more impressive if you realise that at that time, a 10% difference in the effectiveness of our Air Force, either way, would have made a difference between victory and defeat in the Battle of Britain. It was that tight. So just think what doubling it did. So I think you can not an outrageous claim to say this is one of the things that helped win the war. And it was certainly recognised as at that time. It went on to some other major wartime achievements. That's going back a long way. Let's roll forward 75 years. A month or two back, that was the front page of The New Scientist, the algorithm that rules the world. The algorithm they're talking about is the simplex algorithm, or mathematical programming, which of course is one of the techniques used by OR, not just used by OR, it was one of the techniques invented by people working in OR, George Danzig in particular, and others. And they said it was the algorithm that runs the world, which is probably a little bit over the top, because the mathematical programming algorithms are embedded in so many processes, whether it's scheduling processes or routing processes or stocking processes, a whole lot of processes across all those sort of industries I mentioned, at some point or other, and one of them is going to be using that particular algorithm, which is why they picked that name. So it's not always visible, but it's often there and often doing a pretty important thing. Just two examples I picked there, just to show you the sort of things that I was involved in and has achieved. Let's start talking about the general and go to the specific, my life in OR. Okay, prehistory. I did what I guess is a pretty common series of things. To start with at least, A levels in maths and science, a science degree, and postgraduate research, maybe not quite so typically while I was doing research, it was enzyme modelling work. And then it became a little bit odd, because then I actually moved out of science into a management job in the government department. And I did that because I was interested in science, but I was also interested in how things were organised and managed. I wanted to see how that worked. But then I rather missed the science bit, so I went back to a science job as a health scientist in the health service. And at this point you might think, what's this guy playing at? Which was also what I was thinking at the time. Because I had a bit of a problem. There was two worlds I was interested in, science and management. And I started off in university in the science world. I got into a job, actually, immediately afterwards in the management world, and then I've gone back to a job in the science world. So you think, this is looking a bit flaky. So I thought, this can't go on like this. But there was an obvious solution, wasn't there? To actually get the best of both worlds and to actually go into science or operational research equivalent names. So that's what I did. And that really was the rest of my career. I stopped oscillating around in that slightly bizarre manner. I spent my whole career, perhaps rather atypically, in government work, one sort or another, health and social security mostly. And I'll divide that 30-year career into 3 stages: beginning, managing, and leading. I'll just say a little bit about that, maybe particularly about the start part, because you'd be more interested perhaps in that. The first sort of 3, 4, 5 years maybe was learning things. I learned a lot. I hadn't got a postgraduate qualification or an undergraduate qualification in OR, so I had to sort of go on courses and things to pick up those sort of technical skills. But a lot of it was learning by doing, including quite a lot of the modelling and computing, actually rather more of the sort of hard stuff, hard coding, programming those days than you do now. So a lot of modelling and computing. The sort of stuff you'd expect of just applying those skills that you'd learned at university in the real world. But there was also actually other things. Writing, now particularly important in civil service, but actually pretty important in any business. You're working with people, some of whom have come up through arts degrees and so on, and are quite good at writing, and they expect you to be good at it as well. They don't sort of, no hostages taken on that. You've got to be good at the science and the writing. Learning about writing reports, how to write a short report rather than a long report, things like that. Working in teams, pretty obviously, and presenting to clients. Actually working with clients generally, but presenting as a communication, so critical, so critical. So a lot of learning to do there. And then the next stage is sort of more management stage, where I was running projects, running internal teams, running external teams, running mixed teams. I'm not going to talk a lot about the management tasks today, but the move into management is an interesting one, and if you like running things and you like running projects of your own, then that's where you want to get to. And then the final stage was what is sort of the leading stage, and there's a lot of things I can say about this, but I'll just pick one. I mean, a lot of things because you're involved in recruitment and all sorts of organisational things, some of which are interesting, some of which aren't so interesting perhaps. But the one that I thought was really interesting was the creative side of it. You have the opportunity, once you get into a leadership role, of creating whole new areas of work. I'll talk about one of those later. You can start setting up new teams. You can start introducing new ways of working. You can actually change the organisation and changing what's happening around in quite radical ways. And that's, if you want to do that, then you want to go there. There was a huge variety of work over that period. And I could spend a whole day talking about that, and you'll be delighted to know that I'm not going to. Here's rather a heavy slide. I'll just take you through this. It was just to give you a flavour. This is a tiny fraction of the sort of work which we got involved. Just from the top, notice what I've done. I've listed as topic area and the improvement. So remember, improvement science. All the time you're thinking, how can we make something better here? So we looked at things like outpatient clinics. We're looking for shorter waiting times. We looked at things like financial allocation forming, how we move what is now £100 billion of money around the country to distribute funds to the NHS. We looked at something called the balance of care, which is actually how you put together packages of care in health and social care. One incident involves some mathematical programming, but also some quite simple spreadsheet modelling, which in the end is probably more useful. We helped develop new strategies, a thing called self-care support strategy, where we're thinking about how you develop more empowered patients. We did a lot of work on screening and treatment programs, particularly for cancer, where we're looking for more timely and effective care. We looked at hospital capacity and performance, where we're trying to cope with fluctuating demand and keep performance levels the same despite that. And we worked on things like the NHS Direct helpline. We were looking for faster, more accessible healthcare advice. I'll come back to that one. And if you're interested in looking at the techniques, just look on the right-hand side. I'm not going to go through these one by one, but queuing models, regression modelling, mathematical programming, spreadsheet simulation, system mapping, control trials, scenario analysis, all of those at one point or another were involved in those application areas. So pretty big range. There's that spectrum I mentioned. We use all of that spectrum at one time or another. Okay, I'm just going to talk in a little more detail about one project. It's ridiculous, really, just to pick one. The reason I've picked it is partly because it is very much about informed innovation and improvement, partly because it's the only project that I've been involved in that actually was the leading item on BBC television 9 o'clock news when it first appeared, and that is the NHS Direct helpline. I'm just going to say, who's heard of the NHS Direct helpline? Hands up. More than half or so. Anybody use the NHS Direct helpline? Not done so, people. I won't ask you now what you thought of it. Tell me afterwards. Okay. Let's go back. We're going back now to just before the turn of the century, 1997. One of the things we were doing was actually a bit of work looking at what was sort of going on out there in the outside world and what effect it might actually have on healthcare, a bit of scanning work. And one of the things we thought was, this seems a lifetime ago now, doesn't it? But back then, mobile phone and internet use was just beginning to take off. Look, it was running at about 10%, survey showed about 10%. Just think about a time when only 10% of the population had mobile phones and used the internet. But it was going up, and we thought, well, pretty obvious really, this isn't going to go away. This is going to become that most people, or at least more than half, we thought, are going to be into these things. And what's the health service doing to actually pick up on that and to make use of that? Nothing. Just looking ahead a bit, we thought, so there's a problem. I've shown you the rest of that graph with what actually happened, okay, by 2004. So, I mean, we're up to nearly 100% on most of that now. Remember, we didn't know that, but we did guess that reasonably well, that that's what's going to happen. So we had a problem. The world was, in a few years' time, the world was going to be on the right-hand side of that graph with those sorts of communication modes, and the NHS wasn't really making use of that. So we came up with a high-level model, a design for a multi-modal, multi-channel e-health service for the NHS, where you could use, forget the post bit, that's just for convenience, use the telephone, the internet or digital TV to provide many of those services in the middle, certainly information and advice, but also maybe diagnosis, counselling, maybe more difficult with treatment and care, but there's links to that as well. And that would link to the more traditional services like ambulances, hospitals and so on. And that was the design we came up with. We didn't just come up with the design, we actually did some work to demonstrate proof of concept, if you like. Did some survey work that showed that the public wanted, in the first instance, the first port of call would be telephone helplines, they wanted telephone helplines. There's public demand. The professionals, the doctors and the nurses, were largely accepting of that, not all of them, but enough of them thought that would be a good idea. And managers liked it because they thought this would help them run a more efficient service. So there was good evidence and research evidence around the world that we also pulled together to support that. And the result of that, not very long story short, was the government decided to introduce NHS Direct, and early '98, so not long after our work, they introduced that first as a telephone line and then later, bottom right-hand side, as an internet service. And we also did some work on digital TV at one point as well. Once it got up and running, we didn't go away at that point. We then did some more traditional modelling work, looking at things like we had 20 or so NHS Direct call centres. Should we network them electronically, network them and cluster them? If we did, how would that affect the numbers of staff you needed? And not surprisingly, for those of you that ever looked at this sort of thing, the gain is exponential. You gain very rapidly by clustering some sites. Similarly, the cost of meeting a particular response time, say when we do calls, 95% of calls, say in 2 minutes or whatever, also rises exponentially. You could meet 95% quite easily, 97% some difficulty. You want to do 99% to that sort of target, your staffing numbers start rising exponentially. A good example, actually, these bits of work are very simple modelling. This is just basic, a basic simulation model or a simple queuing model formulae will reveal these things. These are used in call centres all the time, these sorts of models. But a very simple bit of modelling, it has quite profound implications. Yes, we should cluster sites. No, you should not offer a 99% level of service because you won't be able to meet it unless you're prepared to triple your staff. These sorts of things. A little modelling can often go quite a long way. So we're involved in not only the design of NHS STREP, but also its delivery. And also its evaluation. We checked to see where it's working. We did some survey work to see what the public thought about it. This was the first one that came back. We didn't actually believe it. It was the highest satisfaction rate we'd ever had on an NHS service, and we had to run the survey again to see whether we had got a spurious result, but we hadn't. The satisfaction levels were and remain pretty high. So, this little story illustrates something about operational research, that it is improvement science, and it follows the learning cycle from diagnosis of problems to design of solutions to a decision about whether or not to adopt it or which one to adopt to support in delivery. And sometimes you go around that cycle all over again if you are in, say, piloting mode. Okay. If anybody really wants to read more about it, there is a paper in the Journal of our Society, 2003, Operational Research for Informed Innovation. But let's move on. I want to say one more thing about my own career in operational research. That's just the timeline you remember. And this is what I want to say. There are 3 bits that were the more difficult bits, and each of them were at a transition point. Starting, moving from sort of learning to managing, and moving from managing to leading. And what I'm going to say about that is, and this is the bad news and the good news, I guess, is you're there, aren't you? You're beginning or thinking about beginning. So I am, and you remember my sort of oscillating history of going backwards and forwards between different jobs. So I am sort of conscious that it's quite a difficult time, exciting time for you, but quite a difficult time. So don't get too discouraged if you find you're finding it difficult to make decisions about what to do. I did as well. They are difficult times, but then they become quite exciting times as well. So don't be downhearted about that. Okay, last part of the talk. What about your life in OR? Question mark. Do you want a life in OR? Well, I don't know that, of course. All I can tell you is just a few questions that maybe you should be asking yourself, if you're not already. One is, what do you need? Okay? There's 2 things you need. The first is some academic qualifications. You need a first degree, including some quantitative skills. I put that quite broadly because our people does take people, both obviously with degrees in operational research or management science or whatever, but also people with degrees in maths, in physics, also people with degrees in geography, biology even. I've had people working for me, I've had astrophysicists working for me, biologists working for me, geographers working for me. One of the very successful people who became a professor afterwards started off as a geographer and then moved into modelling work. So don't be too rigorous about the degree that's required. A master's degree in OR, management science or equivalent will probably help. I say may help. It's not the most important thing, but it's not. But may help. I think it depends on what you've done with it and what you make of it. If you want to go into an academic career in OR, you will need a PhD these days. That's pretty safe to say that. The other thing you need is some personal qualities. 3 I would pick out particularly. Are you a logical, analytical thinker? Got to be that. Do you have an inquiring mindset that's keen on real-world problem solving? Not just theoretical puzzles, but real-world problem solving. Got to have that. And lastly, have you got, or do you think you could develop, good communication and collaborative skills? That's not something that you expect to walk in straight away. Some 1 or 2 of you probably got that up and running, but others it takes, for me, certainly took time, but have you got that, or do you want to develop that? If you can tick those boxes, you're off to a good start. If you've got some crosses by them, you have to maybe think a little bit. Next question might be, will there be jobs? Well, you've seen already the sort of sectors. I think analysts are going to continue to be in high demand in all these sectors and more. As you know for sure, but I'll tell you one story. Again, it's only one story. When I was in the Department of Health, we had a number of cuts exercises, and there was one that was a cut exercise of 30–40%, a really swinging cut. There were only 2 divisions in the department that were not cut at all. One of them was the Minister's private office, the other was the analysts. So I think it's reasonable, analysts can be generally held in pretty high regard while you're doing a good job. So if you're doing a good job, there'll be demand, I think. You might ask what the pay's going to be like. Know you've got enough to live on. The reason I asked so, I did put in the top 10 of career average salaries. It's quite interesting. But I think there are at least 3 more important, perhaps rather deeper questions you should ask yourself. Having sort of met the hygiene factors of you've got the qualifications, is it going to be a job, will the pay be enough to live on? There are some deeper questions. Here's my 3. Firstly, is it flexible? Could it lead you into a number of areas? Well, yes it can. It can be the foundation for a lot of different career paths. Obviously you can come an R analyst and you can do what I do and move into R manager and stay doing that. But you can also move into mainstream management. There are a number of companies that have used their R groups actually as a key stepping stone into management. That's what they expect them to do, so you can do that. You can move into consultancy. You can move back into academia. And this doesn't show it, but what you can do, and a lot of people do, is actually move between some of those. So somebody might go into become a art manager, they might then perhaps go into consultancy, and then they might go back into academia, and then they might go back into consultancy, whatever. People have those sorts of career paths, so you can mix and match between those things. You don't have to make just one-time decision. So yeah, flexibility. So I think you should think about that. Next thing, will it be useful? And I do think operational research actually can help meet some really big real-world challenges. I mean, in the Department of Health, we were dealing with things like pandemics and so on. We can't get a bigger global challenge than that. The RT was heavily involved in building our defences for pandemics and so on. So you can make a real difference in all sorts of areas. And lastly, will you enjoy it? And it does engage, operational research does engage both sides of the brain. You've got the analysis, the left-hand side of the brain, but you've also got the creativity to actually design things and so on. I think it's a nice mix of those things. So things I think you actually should think about. But I must stop and use my time up, and I think it's just a few minutes. If there's any questions, I'll be delighted to have a go at answering.